These Small Hours with Russell Cordell Staker. Hello, my friends. This is the Small Hours podcast, and I am Russell Cordell Staker. Welcome back. What follows is the fourth segment of my novella, In These Small Hours. Please enjoy. Dad found a job working as a cleaner at the Salt Lake City International Airport. Shortly thereafter, he parted with the house and most of the things that were in it. He made enough on the sale to give himself a little egg of security, but it wouldn't last, and he embraced the hard truth of knowing he would work to the very end. Rachel and I helped him find a nice apartment just 10 minutes from the airport in West Valley City with a pretty view of the Ochre Mountains. He settled into his new life and quickly adapted to his custodial profession at the airport. He said he liked the work, that he was grateful it kept him on his feet, and that the environment was befitting of the effort and hours he put into it. It allowed him to survive and provided the means to keep building airplanes in his spare time. He often spoke of the people who worked there and the travelers who passed him by. He enjoyed them all, even though he remained largely invisible to nearly every one of them. I am certain that in the midst of the small conversations he kept with countless individuals, and mostly with himself, he found a way to narrate into the gaps of the stories he imagined for every person he saw. He did his work quietly and with care, and he showed up for every shift with the power and grace of his own resplendent energy. What most wouldn't know about Dad in that role was how dear the cost of the energy he so freely gave. I told him once, a few months into the job, that in a way he was the embodiment of a modern-day Walt Whitman. He was the universal observer to all that was human and curious in such a common and interesting place. He laughed and simply replied, "You're right, my son, only instead of smelling horse shit on some sweltering curb in New Orleans, I smell man shit in stalls across 2 terminals built atop the Great Salt Lake Basin where God declared, 'This is the place.'" For 2 years, day in and day out, Dad did the work as a cleaner and more than thrived. At irregular intervals, we also managed to find small increments of time to work on Bill's Granville GB R2 RC model airplane together, and slowly we began to make progress. For the most part, life settled into a stable routine. We simply made our way through the weeks and months of living and kept the promise of unknown opportunities to come. By late summer and early fall of 2016, I was heavily interviewing for another sales job. One that would pay better than the present job I held, but these potential career options came with the possibility of a move to either Las Vegas or Phoenix. Rachel and I were open to either and realized it might well be the right time to pack up the kids and go, should an offer arrive. Rachel's steady work as a consultant, which had kept us afloat for so long, was adaptable and mobile, but I wanted to give her the freedom to do something different for a change. I was anxious to lift more of the burden from her shoulders after so many years of my incessantly short-term and largely frustrating assignments. After several rounds of interviews with one particular firm, I was invited to fly to Phoenix to meet with its executive sales team. I was thrilled and prepared to give the presentation of a lifetime. It was nearing the end of September of that year, and I remember thinking that finally I was truly about to be on my way after such a painstaking process. Everything went accordingly, and on the day I arrived in Phoenix, I was certain the job would be mine. After giving a flawless presentation, I left the corporate campus and took a shuttle back to the airport for an evening flight home to Salt Lake City. On the ride to Phoenix Sky Harbor, I got a call from the recruiter who told me that while I was exactly what they hoped I would be, the company had decided to take a different path. They didn't want to keep me hanging and felt it proper I know of their decision immediately. I was assured that they were duly impressed and wished me all the best with my career. I was stunned. The air was taken from my lungs. I was as low as I had ever been. I climbed aboard a Southwest Boeing 737 for Salt Lake City in the full knowledge that my career was indeed at an end. I had no further options in front of me. To survive, I would have to jump an S-curve and embark on a path I had never entirely prepared myself to take. About halfway into the flight, just at the point we crossed over into Utah, a storm gathered out below my window. By the time we passed over Provo, the turbulence intensified and the jet began to rock and pitch in the darkening liquid sky against the oncoming headwind as the pilot began her descent into Salt Lake. A dark, pitch-hued cloak draped itself out along the Wasatch and pulsed under the strobe light of stencil-thin fingers of wicked lightning. I could hear several people gasp as the jet tossed to and fro on its way to the field. I was grateful for the scare, if only for the distraction it provided from a deeper internal pain I felt inside. I closed my eyes and thought of all of the times I had stood on the ground and watched the jets come home into Salt Lake. I envisioned the Boeing 737 I was sitting on as it approached on final, just under the darkening horizon along the craggy grandeur of those perfectly majestic mountains, its tracer lights blinking, headlights ablaze over its broad wings, nose up, wheels flexing just under its carriage in anticipation of solid ground like a mechanical bird, graceful and beautiful, emerging out of some angry avian sea. The night sky was riddled with wet, sharp daggers of lightning coursing from the demon palms of some mad electric god. We touched down with a hard thud and rolled abrasively into the sound of reverse thrusters. I opened my eyes. I walked from the jet bridge through the gate and out onto the concourse, lost in my own despair. It was late in the evening, and the airport for the most part was tranquil and cool. I didn't want to call Rachel. I would wait to tell her the bad news when I got home. And then, trance-like, I looked up and saw Dad pushing a mop at the far end of the curving walkway as it led to the sky bridge at the top of Terminal 2. He was standing at a 45-degree angle to an invisible line along the floor he was elegantly working. He moved the mop in time with the rhythm of his body in a luxuriant figure-8 motion, rocking back and forth on his feet, his knees slightly bent. It was beautiful to see. I remembered what Dad said about narrating into the gaps of the life of his own father, and how he learned something new every time he did. In similar fashion, and within the space of 100 yards as I walked to Dad and gently touched him on the shoulder, I narrated into the gaps of the life of my father as an airport cleaner. What came was deeper than the universal aspect of the responsibilities he honored, of the trash he hauled, the stalls he cleansed, the toilets he set right, the glass and mirrors and windows and floors he returned to presentable order, the soft and unheard greetings he innumerably offered and sometimes received in return, the grace of his deference in the clean space he kept and maintained, the ground he gave to offer others passage while standing at the periphery, the quiet hours of getting himself dressed, of preparing his cleaning cart with the necessary supplies, of the insulin he took and the blood sugar he monitored, of the meals he packed and the Snickers bar he kept in the front pocket of his yellow vest, of the minor lists he wrote for himself of the small things he hoped to get to in the spare hours after a long day at work, of the absence he felt when he thought of his son Bill, who wouldn't be there when he got home. What came clear to me in that small walk out of my own frustration was the declarative awareness of the personified art I saw in the man with the mop. If you can think and not make thought your aim, and lose and start again at the beginning, and never breathe a word about your loss, you'll be a man, my son. Dad was every bit the man with the voice in Rudyard Kipling's poem, the one he so often read to Bill and I out of the old book of verse Mom kept at her writing desk. The words were Kipling's, but they were also the words of my father. Words he was living right in front of me in plain sight. But even then I refused this clarity of feeling for my father as the antidote to counteract the bitter poison of defeat welling in my heart. I was lost in my own self-pity. I had come home, but I was far away. Dad did not see me coming, and the look of surprise on his face after I touched him angered me, and to this day I ache knowing that it did. I was pleasant in my tone, but sullen of spirit. "It's my boy," he said. "Hey, Dad." "I didn't know you were away." "Yeah, I didn't know I was going to be away until I was." "Did you already have the interview?" "Sort of. Well, yes. It's more than that. I was asked after the last interview to fly to Phoenix and give a sales presentation, and I trailed off. It doesn't matter. I didn't get the gig." Dad started to say something to comfort me, but I don't remember what. I cut him off and waved my hand in the air as I did so. I didn't want to hear any of his old sales stories or garner any of his cheerleading optimism. He stood there under industrial lighting, exhausted and spent, just an old man with a mop. Dad, to his credit, read between the space of the turbulence I carried and simply put his arm around me and asked if he could walk with me down to baggage claim. And so we walked together and said very little. We parted at the sliding glass doors. Dad looked at me and said, "Ransom, you're not a marble and you don't need their track. I'm proud of you. Go home and get some sleep." Not long after that night at the airport, I drove to Dad's place in West Valley City to put the finishing touches on GB. The Dodgers were playing the Giants on Fox, and we cracked a few Coors Lights and shared in the satisfaction of finishing the plane together. Indirectly, Bill was present in that working conversation. It was the first time in my memory of ever finishing a plane without him. But somehow, rather than feeling the ache of his absence, we acknowledged the serendipity of his presence. With the plane finished, we went over to the couch to sip beer and watch the game on TV. As Dad looked at the game, I looked at him. He appeared older than his years would otherwise suggest, but he looked good too. And in spite of my concern for his overall health and the demands of his job, I sensed he was okay. He just kept moving forward. "I'm sorry about the other night," I said. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said, but I knew better. In my heart, I had been in most awful shit. I had let my despair canker the beauty of what I had seen when I found my father at work. It allowed that despair to snub the care he offered at a moment I needed it most. And I gave him nothing in return. But I made no mention of this to Dad. "You doing all right, Dad?" I asked. "I'm managing," he said. "Grateful for my work. Just sorry it keeps me from spending more time with my boy. But we're here now, right?" "Yeah, Dad, we are." Dad looked back at me. "I knew you were having a hell of a wrestle when you flew in the other night. I spent this past week replaying our clipped conversation in my mind, wanting to offer more clarity to the sorts of things we were approaching without fully saying. I thought of my own dad and how difficult it was to really talk to him. I regretted suddenly feeling as if I had stepped into his shoes and you and mine in that conversation because we were both in an impasse, full of love and good intentions, but misfiring in the language, mostly because life gets in the way. I don't have to tell you what you already know, and I don't worry about our standing with each other. I just wish I had more to give, something more meaningful to offer. I wish I could solve the complexity of the very things you are experiencing in your life, and maybe I wish I could do the same for myself. But this is life, and it just doesn't work that way. In a sense, our relationship as father and son is not uncommon to so many others. It's just thinned a bit, lost in a funk of inadequacy. You'll just have to forgive me. Maybe I'm just a casualty to my own false sense of failure. Sometimes failing feels more real than any success I've known. While I was at work this week, I got to thinking about all of the things I can't do for you. I can't give you land. I can't give you title. I certainly haven't given you any pedigree. I can't give you any gold. Just isn't much I can do because none of that stuff is mine to give. But I can give you the man. Dad slapped the palms of his hands against his chest. This man. Just as I see him now, right smack in the middle of the lines of his aging life. This is the man that I am. The one I wouldn't have imagined I'd become when I was a younger man. But it's who I have become. And this man has a little something to offer in the cobbled history of his own story, a minor story I haven't told you yet. It's a chronicle of what I call the bootstrap moments of my life. The gut-wrenching times I'd have to force myself to rise up and grit my teeth to face what life meted out unpredictably and unevenly. Those were the times that defined me, and I'm leaning on them now. I'm a plain man in this world, but there was a time when I wasn't so plain. Dad sipped on his can of Coors Light. In the fall of '82, I was in Twin Falls working the book for the Yellow Pages. I was into my sophomore season after quite literally being Rookie of the Year in '81. As a bit of context, I made the jump from the newspaper business, which you probably remember as a little boy just after Bill was born, and we moved into our old yellow house. Your mom and I were just barely getting by on my $17,500 a year salary. In spite of my title and responsibilities, the newspaper was a dead duck. I was lucky to make the jump to AT&T and the Yellow Pages. That first year I made $85,000, and it literally changed my entire outlook on life. I was in my early 30s and had never had that kind of money before. Suddenly, everything seemed within reach. We moved to North Salt Lake and got the house you grew up in. Your mom was a real stunner. You boys were as cute as buttons. Life was happy. I remember feeling like the sky was bluer, the grass greener, the snow whiter, and everything was clicking. Just 2 years prior, I'd driven Mom and Dad's old Chevy Pickle with the hole in the floorboard through the slush from Boise all the way to Salt Lake City on a bitter winter morning, with my stomach in my throat, sick with worry that I wasn't going to ever get out of the newspaper, that the interview I was moving towards that morning was nothing more than a shitty pipe dream. No way they were going to hire me, but they did, and now I was looking back as if it were an entire lifetime ago. I was 33 and had the world by the balls. God damn it, I did. Dad clenched his right hand into a fist. I was Poncho and Lefty all in one, and I rolled into a franchise Oldsmobile lot in January of '82 and traded in that old Ford Escort your mom and I had been running with duct tape and got us a brand new Toronado, cream white with lavender red trim on top and leather interior and power windows. Later that night, after we'd gotten you boys to bed, your mom and I made the chassis on that car bounce on our front driveway, and I didn't give a shit what the neighbors saw. As far as I was concerned, I was Hugh Hefner. It was big times and little rodeo for your dad. I was bulletproof. I rolled through the meat of '82, tearing up book campaigns for every market with the yellow pages until that gorgeous autumn when I entered Twin Falls. The sun hung in the sky at midday, putting bright definition on the fading color of the leafy trees. The air was crisp and delicious. It was my time of the year, the part I always lived for, and that fall I had big plans. I got into town with the guys to set up for a 2-week campaign like we were the Rolling Stones on tour. I told your mom I was going to stay over through the week and just work the book straight. My plan was to close all my accounts quickly, come home and take a week off, pawn you boys out with friends and take your mom to Sun Valley to play. She thought it was a good idea. I went out that first night after making a few calls and sat at the bar with Lonnie and had a cold beer in a tall glass. It felt good in spite of the fact that all that day I'd struggled to make any traction with any of my accounts. Something didn't feel right. I was overreaching or something. I felt off. Lonnie and I talked a while at the bar, and then he told me he was going to go out trolling the local honeypots with the other guys. Wanted to know if I cared to join them, but I said, nah. Dad waved his hand and smirked. I never participated in that kind of activity for 2 reasons. First, I loved your mom. She was the best woman I've ever known. And second, I just didn't have the capacity to carry that kind of electricity. I wouldn't have known what to do with it. And so I just went back to my room thinking I'd work on the airplane I brought along to build. A dark cloud lumbered in over me that night. It was the damnedest thing. I'd never experienced anything like it before, like a mental flu. A panic set in, and I didn't know what to do. I crawled into bed. For a long time, I just lay there feeling trapped in my body. I couldn't sleep. Round about 5 in the morning, I bolted out of bed and threw up in the toilet, then got into the shower and shivered through a steaming hot blast of water for 20 minutes and talked myself through the coming day. The sales calls I had lined up, the dollars I was going to make, and all the reasons why it mattered, why it was essential for the very survival of my family. I talked myself through a logical explanation of why I was not dying, even though I felt like I was. Something was terribly wrong, and I was frightened. I got myself dressed and ready for the day, left the motel, and walked across the highway to a little diner and sat in a corner booth and forced myself to eat. It was all I could do to hang on to my knife and fork, keep my feet on the ground under the table. I was slipping, but maintained a calm air, and noted the waitress serving me kept the same disinterested gaze when she looked at me as she did with anyone else. After I ate, I walked back across the highway to the motel room and paced until 8:30 in the morning. I thought about calling Evelyn, but I wasn't sure I would explain to her what was happening. Nothing made sense, and calling her would only make things worse. So I sucked it up and suffered through it, alone. My first appointment was at 9 a.m., just 5 minutes down the road. It was a used car lot with a good guy owner I'd closed the year before for nearly $10,000 for a full-page block print listing. He ran a good business with an established brand in Twin. It was going to be an easy repeat sale, but I couldn't do it. Without thinking, I walked over to the bedside table, sat on the bed, and picked up the receiver of the pea-green phone and dialed the dealer to cancel the appointment. I told him I'd get back with him later in the week, that something had come up. He sounded a little confused on the line, but I didn't linger and hung up. I then went down the list of 6 other businesses I was set to see that day and canceled each appointment one after the other, telling them all the same thing I'd told the dealer. And then I drew the shades, got undressed, crawled back in bed, and didn't move until 2 in the afternoon. When I awoke, the day was lost, and so was I. The next morning, I got up and went through the same routine. I did it again the following day. On Friday of that week, I managed to get out and keep my appointments, but I found that I began to have sweats during the calls. I was wearing beige pants that day and sweat so bad during a call that it looked as if I pissed my pants. It would be months before I ever wore beige or brown pants again. Needless to say, the Twin Falls book was an epic failure. I was in a sudden nosedive. At the time, I couldn't really put my finger on it, but the simple answer was that I was in a deep depression fueled by a sudden shift of expectation. I was making real money, but I was also existing on the edge of a knife. A man finds himself at times in places that seem to be working, but in reality are overextensions of the biggest fears and anxieties he keeps way down, deep inside. On the surface, I was afraid of failing to sell, but underneath I was afraid to fail as a man, as a husband, as a father. Being on the road was never easy. I'd been doing it for 18 months, most months 3 weeks out of every month. I'd typically be up and out all across Idaho, Utah, Montana, Wyoming from Monday morning to Friday afternoon. If I wasn't driving, I was flying one of those little mosquito prop planes you and Bill would get so excited about. It was taking a toll on me and also on Evelyn. The money was good, but the pressure was mounting. And the demands of life with 2 young boys was a lot. The burden I bore was the guilt of obligation. That if I didn't stay on the road, that if I didn't keep closing those yellow page advertising deals, I would fail at everything in the balance, lose everything I had. It's the nature of a salesman to face rejection, to walk the plank to the very edge every day and know that the pirate ship that carries him is only abiding his presence, suffering it even, so long as he carries his weight and washes the deck while he does so. Otherwise, he's done for and walked off the edge into the abyss of uselessness, forgotten, left to sink by his own dead weight. The slump that started in Twin carried on through the holidays and into the new year. I was managing a far deeper depression by this point. There were some dynamics at home with your mom that I won't get into, but I will mention that I felt as if all my fears were bringing into acute reality every aspect of a predetermined, self-fulfilling prophecy. It was around this time that my senior director from the Denver office called and asked to ride along with me. Said he was going to fly into Twin Falls the following week when I was set to return from my back-end campaign in Twin. The call made me sick. What I found out later was that Luis Rodriguez had already begun the paperwork to have me fired for lack of performance. The ride-along was more of a formality. He'd been distant for weeks. Our conversations had been clipped, and I felt my own voice muted whenever I offered my monthly sales forecasts. We typically hit every market twice within a fiscal year. The front-end campaign was to close the new book. The back-end campaign was to clean up what we'd missed the first time through. I was set to meet with a guy who owned a large prosthetics manufacturing business, the largest in the state of Idaho, it turns out. And he wanted to take down Utah by advertising even bigger towards an expansion there. I'd never met this guy before. He was a burly ex-Vietnam Marine who'd made a fortune in prosthetics. He'd refused to work with the Yellow Pages the previous year, largely due to the fact that he thought the sales rep was an asshole. The ex-Marine had a big enough brand and a large enough network of clients across the country that he didn't feel advertising in the Yellow Pages made much sense anyway. He ran a specialized, highly matrixed business that had strategically integrated itself into a broad spectrum of device and healthcare consortiums. His name was Cruz, and all I knew about him, aside from being an ex-Marine, was that he had grown up in Idaho Falls and that he'd gone to the same high school as I did. I never knew him or his family. It didn't change the fact that I was in for a very uphill climb if I were to close this potential ad deal. So I picked up Lewis at the Twin Airport, which at the time was literally just a one-runway strip with a couple of gates. It was late January, and there was a good foot of frozen snow caked onto the ground. The air was sharp, and it was brutally cold. We went to a coffee shop and had breakfast, and I walked Lewis through my plan for the day. He didn't say much, and I struggled to offer any idea or uplift to the potential I felt capable of converting to sales. We drove out to Cruz's office and sat in a small boardroom on a leather couch facing his big cherrywood desk. He sat a good 3 feet higher than we did from his swivel chair, and I remember thinking that it was like selling to a burly priest up on a dais. He was looking down on us like the ghost of Christmas present. Lewis said very little. Cruz said even less. I struggled through the call and basically ended it with a, "We'll get back at you, Cruz," with some layouts, briar patch close, as they call it. What was most aggravating about the call was that when I showed up, I didn't even have a copy of the Twin Falls book with me. I normally always put the current market book in a briefcase I carried around, but I wasn't prepared that morning. Cruz had an extra one laying around, which was a miracle in and of itself, considering he'd made no advertising claim in the Yellow Pages for the prior year, and said he didn't believe in it. I knew I was cooked when we walked out the door and shuffled to the car. I was prepared to be fired right then and there. I was sick to my stomach. My skin tingled, and I was sweating in 15 degrees of winter air. I fired up the Tornado and put the car in reverse. Lewis reached up and put his hand on the wheel and told me to keep it parked. I was ready. I've never been physically executed in my sales career. I've faced execution no differently than a man being sent to the guillotine in revolutionary France. It's blood-chilling. It takes all you've got to face it, the most empty feeling in the world. The sudden, cold clarity of scarcity that comes with it is enough to shrivel the meanest, baddest bull's dick and balls in a New York minute. Lewis looked at me and said, "Carl, you're a good and smart salesman, but you're in a funk. You're dying on the vine, my man, and I don't understand why. I didn't come here to fire you. I came here to give you a bit of advice. Don't be this job. It's not you. Do the job, but don't take it so seriously. You've got to tap into something bigger than these sales calls, and you've got to find a pace that allows you to be you. I know you have it in you because you kicked hell out of everyone on the team last year. You're the natural, and we hired you because of it. That call with Cruz was pathetic, but it's not over because that guy likes you. He's going to buy from you, and despite what I saw in there, that would give me every reason to let you go, especially in light of the last 3 months of non-performance. But I also recognize what you have that no one else under my command has, and that's presence. So this is what I want you to do. I'm going to let you drop me off at the airport right now, and I'm going to fly home so I can fuck my wife tonight. You're going to finish today and tomorrow, and you're going to drive home 2 days early, and you're going to fuck your wife. Hell, fuck her twice. I want you loose. Got it? I also want you to do 3 things over the next 90 days. 1, on every sales call, offer service. 2, on every sales call, give perspective with an idea or two that gets your customer to think differently about Yellow Pages. Whether it makes them buy or not, I don't give a good goddamn, but change their thinking. And 3, forget selling full pages. Go for the small block ads with the logo. Close 10 of those accounts every week for the next 90 days, and then I'm going to come and ride with you again in Salt Lake City. Now, Ransom, what Lewis did was lead this horse to water, Dad pointed to himself. That conversation changed me. In the near term, his advice about the 10 block ads was brilliant because selling those wasn't that hard, and for every one of those block ads, I was naturally able to upsell half of them to full pages or more. What he did was get me out of my head by playing small ball first, sort of like being sent down to the minors to play AAA ball to get out of a tailspin before re-entering the bigs in Dodger Blue. In the long run, he changed how I saw sales, and through it, and though it wouldn't save me from the eventual and unavoidable demise of the death of this salesman, which comes to us all at some point, I sense you're going through some of that right now, he provided the key to the rest of my career that carried me for the next 25 years. When I got back to my motel, I took out a piece of paper and wrote down the names of you boys and your mom, and at the bottom I simply wrote, offer service, give ideas. I carried that piece of paper in my front shirt pocket for the next 2 years before I got too beat up and tattered to carry anymore. It was my courage and a reminder of what I was really about. The paper is long gone, but the essence of the message remains, and it still helps me, even now as I push around a cleaning cart at the Salt Lake City airport. In sales, there are good books and really bad books. The ebb and flow is part of the cycle of the game, and it's also the most difficult aspect for the sales professional to master. Most of management has its head so far up its self-entitled lazy ass to fully understand any of this anyway. It's far too common to work in sales under idiots who've retired from sales and who were never really all that good at it to begin with, in spite of whatever success they had that got them promoted. Except for Lewis, I say, fuck them all. I didn't stop sweating, and I certainly never entirely outran the cold depression that set over me that year like a dark mental flu. But I did overcome it, and I got on with my life. I learned to embrace the dark when it came and to look at it dead on without blinking. Selling became a skill that I largely mastered. Yes, I brought a strong natural element and proclivity to it, but I added on to those abilities with practice over time. To me, the relationship with the customer always mattered. It was why I could get up in the morning and face the rejection that was going to come with it. I knew as long as I found some reason to offer one good idea, to change the thinking of a customer and offer a little something of myself by way of service, that the lasting impression I had with any customer was genuine. That was always more meaningful than the paycheck, and trust me, I needed the paycheck. Those were heady days, my son. 1982 faded away and became a memory, which is now just an anecdote in a phase of my life that is long gone, entirely out of reach, even foreign to me now. My life does seem as if it is just a passing dream. The good years that are so quickly upon you often don't really strike you as truly good, even when you know damn well that they are. It's always in hindsight that you realize what you had, what you're in the middle of, and why it really was so profligately vital. I don't long for those days, not now, but I miss the salad. At this stage of the game, I don't really know how to apply those years to what's left. It's like dancing with ghosts in a narrative play that only you can see. I'm still assessing sales calls like a chess player, trying to read the board and understand why I made the moves I made and what I should have done instead. In the end, the career I had provided. I think that's the best I can say about it. It's also the most mature and humble way of assessing what was once something substantive and then suddenly removed. I wished it would have continued on. I wish that what I put into it was an equal measure to what I thought I was going to get out of it. In the end, the job, the career, the progression I took is largely unimportant and quaint. It defined a big part of my self-identity and purpose, and when it was gone, it also took that identity. You know as well as I do that I was never the job. Lord knows I never had the kind of title or power that would warrant any such temptation. I was always just a hired gun, a very effective hired gun, but nothing more. I was happiest closing 6-figure deals in 30 minutes over fish and chips and a beer in Bozeman or Salt Lake City or Boise with clients I sold Yellow Pages to for years. The relationships I earned, I kept. I always thought that platform would continue on into perpetuity, but it didn't. The world changed, and it will keep changing. Honestly, it doesn't matter now. I don't have the gas or interest in breaking it all down beyond what I'm telling you now, Ransom. The company that I worked for was stupid. It pissed away a vast resource it selfishly abused, cashed itself in at the altar of greed so typical and rampant at the executive level, and offloaded all its obligations to the very workers that built it into what it was before it was no more. To think now that I sold Yellow Pages in the face of a world that only knows Google is to put in fine print how illogical and fleeting business ideas and strategies really are. It's all bullshit, and rarely does it mean a goddamn thing. I feel as if I'm a dinosaur from an age as distant as the Jurassic period. I mention this not for the surface reasons that are easy to point to, and I'm not trying to make a parallel to the struggles you've conveyed in the hamster wheel round robin of your expressed frustrations of the corporate world. I'm only bringing it up more for myself and assessing a harder reality, one which put a finer point on a perspective I never had of my own father, who spent his entire life without ever really getting an opportunity to excel at anything. He was an intelligent man, gifted with his hands as a master mechanic, but he was also a well-spoken interlocutor, and had he been more in possession of the moxie I ended up with, might have actually made something of himself that he would have felt matched the drive he had, the drive that was ultimately snuffed out at the hands of decision-makers who made a point of detouring what they readily saw in him. I think it might be a bit of the striker curse. I made an honest break to get out beyond where Dad was so certifiably stuck, and for a brief period of time, against all odds, I was on the come. Things were within my grasp, and I was good, really good, at sales. I could bridge relationships and close business and manage the fear of illogical expectation to confront rejection and will myself into a better world of abundance. I think what most worked for me was my ability to bend the truth just enough without breaking it, to will a certain ideology for myself upon my customers. Ultimately, in sales, this is justifiable because you, as the salesman, are the painter, the dreamer of dreams, the music maker, the candy maker, the money maker. Sure, you're asking for a signature on a dotted line and the immediate commitment of the person across from you to stop whatever the hell they're doing and stroke you and your company a check right then and there, and to commit to keep stroking those checks long after you've left. It's like the painting by Remington, a dash for the timber. You're in to make the deal and then you're out, and on your horse at full gallop while your competition and even some of the customers you sold to and persuaded with a few half-truths and conscious lies are gunning for you in the distance. You're ducking lead and firing off shoulder and hip shots at your rear, hoping to knock a few of the bastards off their ponies before they knock you off. Every town was the same. Every deal had that potentiality. I'd wake up some mornings with an almost hangover of guilt, not out of some false sense that what I'd sold was a terrible mistake for the customer, but out of a genuine hope without confirmation that it would end up being all that I said it would be. I didn't study Shakespeare like you, my boy, but I had Shakespeare in me, and I was wooing the best of them and their little wagging dogs too. I was always outrunning what was inevitably going to catch me, and it did. And it has. In consideration of the career I had, I think that post-war World War II Pax Americana set my generation up to hog it all and be as fatuous and self-serving in the idea that America was the land of the big cheeseburger and big car, with the big speakers blaring the Beach Boys, and it was all for the taking. In truth, that's damn right, and there was nothing wrong with it so long as most capitalists realized that there was more than enough to go around. There was no need to hoard the wealth or the prospect of the technology to come, and all of the jobs that were so available and generally equal to be had. It was a time to be a salesman, and by the time I came around in the early 80s, on into the aughts of the 21st century, it was the gravy years, but the end was there. I couldn't foresee the terrible aspect of the greed and cosmopolitan consolidation of power and wealth and digital gadgetry that single-handedly rendered my industry, the cash cow Yellow Pages, moot and irrelevant. The saddest aspect of it all isn't that the Yellow Pages died, it's that the art of the relationship, the mystification of the selling banter and an on-premise discourse largely came to an end. I was a buffalo, and the buffalo are now all gone. The world itself was oversaturated with selling teams and representatives by the time you were off to college, and my career was on the downward spiral. From my vantage point, I'm perplexed at the working world you must contend with now, and it's a crying shame that the very companies that have shuttled you around like a short-term selling journeyman also strap you with the living debt and blame of having to keep moving just to survive. It's their own damn mess, not yours. There is no loyalty, and we have corporate America to thank for that. And every church along the way just keeps telling the angry and ignorant masses to take it in stride because Jesus will make it right in the end. Horse shit. I'm sorry that I can't offer you the kind of advice I once thought I was going to be able to offer you in your middle-aged years. I've been stripped of all of that. And I've been stripped of all that I had and have been left so confused by the nature of what I used to do that I don't even see much relevance in any of it now. The customers alone in the business world of today themselves neither understand nor respect the value of a lasting selling relationship with the vendors that largely call on them via the telephone or email these days. I do look forward to what you've told me about your proposed idea for writing about the demise of selling due to the over-rotation of business development. I think you're very much onto something there, but if I have any advice for you, my son, I would tell you to write a novel and skip the business writing. This world is too full of assholes who can barely read their name. You might as well write a book that the good few with heart and willful intelligence will bleed just to read. You might end up poorer than me in the end, but you will have given your voice to something that lasts. Be a writer at all costs. It's who you are. Dad brushed his hands over his face and gave me a smile. Then he said, working the airport cleaner job has been an interesting platform from which to see things. Pushing a bright yellow cart around offers a unique perspective. In a way, I feel a little like Walt Whitman, who put himself into the faces of the people passing by on the crowded streets he walked. I don't mind being unseen. I'm not much to look at. There is something about the plainness of life that appeals more to me now than it ever has. It's like standing on the grassy bank of a busy river with a current so fast and cold, you know you wouldn't be able to swim at it like you used to. But as you stand there watching it run, you get a glimpse at the sort of fish you once were. Only now, you're no longer a fish at all. You're something different. You become a different form of body, one that forgot how to breathe water. Now you just breathe air. And so you breathe air, and you watch, and you stand dry under the sun on that grassy bank alongside the fast-moving river. And you remember what it was like to be slippery in the cold current down where the rocks glisten and the sunlight filters through, and prisms of light turn to rainbows and diamonds and shadows too. And suddenly you realize you're seeing it all for the first time. I took in every word. Dad indeed gave me the man. And though the mystery of a father to a son is inevitable, I knew I'd been granted a lifetime of answers. A good man is good like a profound truth is true. We watched the end of the game together and agreed we'd fly GB the first weekend of October. Thank you for being with me here in these small hours.